Hey everyone, tonight we're going to drift back in time into a quiet village where not much ever happened. And that was exactly the charm of it. The evening is settling in, soft and slow. The sun has dipped behind the hedgerows, casting long shadows across the lower fields where a faint mist begins to gather. A wooden mug rests on the table beside the fire, empty for now, but familiar in its waiting. The mug is stained from use and slightly warm from proximity to the hearth. It is not special, and yet it has been present for many quiet evenings like this one. Its weight is known to the hand that will soon lift it. It needed only time, and a bit of warmth, and someone to keep watch as it turned from cloudy water to golden comfort. Some added herbs, others didn't. Some brewed it strong, others so mild that even children drank it with their porridge. It wasn't questioned, it just was. In one old cottage, leaning ever so slightly from centuries of withstanding wind and weather, a small fire has been lit. In the mornings, the first sip might come before the fire was even lit, just a few mouthfuls to greet the frost. Not to wake the mind, but to ease it. There is no urgency here, no drama. Only a small comfort, taken slowly. The taste is soft, barely there, more texture than flavor. It leaves behind a warmth that has nothing to do with heat and everything to do with memory. Children, too, drank from the mug, though theirs was gentler still, more like flavored water than anything else. It was never considered odd. Light catches the rim, makes it glow just a little. It did not make heroes. It did not fix anything, but it helped people carry on. And for most lives, that was enough. When the days were long and the fields muddy, when the hands were sore and the thoughts too many, the ale waited, quiet, ready, without judgment. Outside, the mist has risen higher, reaching the lower windows. They just drank it, the way one pulls a blanket over their shoulder at night, not because they're cold, necessarily, but because it feels good to be covered. Inside, the barrel below the floor creaks slightly as it settles, as if the day, in all its rough corners, has been smoothed just enough to allow sleep to come. Perhaps it's full, perhaps not. There is always enough for one more cup. It doesn't shout with sparks or roar with heat. Ale was like a bench beneath a tree or a patch of sun across the floor. Recipes were loose, passed by feel and memory rather than parchment. There was no right way, just whatever worked, whatever warmed. Some ale was sweet, others bitter. Some too thick, some too flat. Still, it was made and shared. Useful, unassuming, part of the rhythm. It carried no celebration, no ceremony. And yet, it carried people from hour to hour, through field and rain and winter and war. Instead, it murmurs gently like someone halfway between sleep and waking, stirred only by the pull of habit, not urgency. The room glows softly, amber light dancing across uneven walls. She would nod once in a while, lift the lid, stir gently, then leave it to rest again. She was not a priestess, not a scientist, just someone who knew when the brew was ready by the way the bubbles sighed or the scent turned mellow. Her work was not praised, but it was trusted. There is a stillness here, not of silence, but of calm repetition. The sky outside has turned a thick, inky blue, and the mug, still waiting near the hearth, is finally filled. Not to toast or cheer, but simply to hold warmth between two hands. The drink is not hot, it is not sweet. It is not surprising, but it is deeply familiar. The kind of stillness that lives between chores and sleep, in the soft breathing of the floorboards and the patient leaning of shelves filled with things nobody moved anymore. A kettle hangs over the fire, hissing faintly. And somewhere deeper in the house, below the creaking planks, a barrel waits in shadow. Ale is there, and it has been for a long time. Not just in this house, but in all the others, too in the village, across the hills, by the river, in towns and castles and abbeys. It waits in cool places, inside thick wood resting. And so they boiled it, added grain, let it sit in barrels to become something else. They made ale, not as a luxury, not as a treat, but as a solution. It became a quiet companion to their lives, a warm, simple answer to a complicated world. This isn't a story about a great event or a great person. This is a story about something small and everyday, something steady, something that made the long days shorter and the cold nights softer. Long ago, people learned that the water they drank could betray them. It shimmered like glass, but carried with it hidden dangers, illness, fever, weakness. Ale didn't ask anything of them. It was easier to make than bread and lasted longer than milk. There's a softness to that kind of presence, something always nearby, never loud, always welcome. As the day wore on, the mug might be refilled once or twice, never in excess, always without fanfare. In some homes, the brewing happened in small corners, where kettles doubled as cooking pots and spoons were warm from years of stirring. The alewife, often the woman of the house, kept the fire going and watched the bubbling patiently. Evening returns again, as it always does. The tasks are done. The chickens are quiet. A sip, and then another. Not rushed. The fire pops once. The old floor creaks in reply. Someone might hum softly, or just exhale. The mug rests again on the table. Ale was not the answer to life's greatest questions. Some say it made people sleepy. Others say it made time pass easier. Most didn't think about it at all. And now, the mug is nearly empty. The room is quiet. The fire has lowered. Nothing important has happened. But everything feels slightly better, slightly softer. In the days when the land was quieter and the nights arrived slowly, water shimmered with a gentle sort of beauty. It flowed through the meadows and trickled down moss-covered stones, collecting in shallow wells, wooden buckets, and ceramic jugs. Not all at once, and not with certainty, but gradually, like learning the mood of an old road or the habits of a restless wind. They saw how drinking from some streams led to coughing, how wells near crowded streets brought fever, and how, sometimes, the clearest water caused the deepest harm. There were no microscopes then, no knowledge of tiny organisms, only patterns of pain that quietly repeated themselves. They just knew that when you boiled water with grains, let it cool, and left it to sit near warmth, something changed. It wasn't meant to cheer the soul or loosen tongues. These women, often called alewives, didn't need recipes. The grain would be stirred and strained, the liquid poured into wooden tubs or clay vessels. Then it would wait. Days would pass. Natural yeasts, drifting in from the air or clinging to old spoons, would do their quiet work. Crowded streets, poor drainage, and shallow wells turned water into a frequent enemy. People who had no access to fresh springs learned quickly which drinks were safe and which were not. They didn't need to understand the science. They only needed to remember what happened last time. It helped settle the stomach and soothe the nerves. Elders drank it because it felt easier than water. The sick drank it because it rarely made things worse. And everyone else drank it simply because that was what you did. A practice carried not by parchment, but by presence. Brewed in small kitchens with low ceilings. Sipped in silence. Trusted. And in a world where many things were uncertain, that meant something. No one toasted. No one paused to praise it. It was there, like firewood, like wool, like the roof overhead. They had instinct. A handful of barley, a splash of warm water, a sense of when to lift the mash or when to let it rest. Sometimes a batch would bubble oddly, and someone would mutter that the moon had shifted wrong. But nothing was wasted. It was all part of the pattern. Brewing ale was not about perfection. It was about continuation. They brewed with memory, not measurement. It was cloudy and soft, a drink for breakfast, for children, for the workers in the fields. It sat at the edge of the hearth in ceramic jugs, as ordinary as a broom or a loaf of bread. A sip shared its sunset by the fire. The ale was never meant to last. They were simply doing what had always been done. And perhaps, without ever saying so aloud, they felt a little safer for it. It soured quickly, and so the rhythm continued. Brew, drink, brew again. They recorded which batches lasted longest, or which herbs gave better taste. But even there, the purpose was not intoxication. Monks brewed for pilgrims, for the ill, for laborers, and the poor. Ale was sustenance, gentle, familiar, a kindness in a cup, day after day, season after season, a ritual without pageantry. Just care. What came out was not water anymore, and what it offered was different too. It didn't make people sick. In fact, it often made them feel better. That was enough. It looked clean. It sounded pure. It promised refreshment. But for all its charm, water was not always to be trusted. Thin, slightly sour, warm if it hadn't yet cooled. It was a drink without surprise, and that was part of its charm. The world already held enough uncertainty. The ale, at least, could be relied upon. Stomachs would turn, and once strong limbs would grow weak. The elders didn't know why. But they remembered which water made the neighbors sick. They remembered which homes buried their young too soon. And so, slowly, without ceremony, they stopped trusting water as it was. People noticed. But when it came to drinking, people began to look elsewhere. Not for anything fancier, only for something safer. And that is how ale, humble and homemade, became the quiet solution. The children would fall ill after a sip from the wrong cup. It was still needed, of course. It boiled the porridge. It washed the linens. It filled the basins used to scrub the floors. They didn't call it innovation. They didn't call it chemistry. Small ale, they called it. Barely fermented, barely alcoholic, and always made fresh. It wasn't brewed to celebrate. The brewing happened in the home. Most often, it was the women, the mothers, the widows, the daughters, who stirred the pots and minded the heat. On cool mornings, the scent of boiling malt would drift through the beams of a crooked-roofed house, curling into corners where dust slept untouched. There was no celebration when the ale was ready. Only a quiet ladling into cups. A mug passed to a child with bread. Water, meanwhile, flowed as it always had. But now it was eyed with caution. In the cities, things were worse. In the monasteries, the monks took brewing further. They wrote things down. They timed the fermentations. There was something comforting in its sameness. A mug of small ale tasted nearly the same from one town to another. Children drank it as part of growing up. Even its flaws were accepted. Some brews turned out too bitter. Others soured faster than expected. And so, in the soft breath of the past, people drank ale not as indulgence, but as quiet defense. It was the solution whispered between generations, not because they craved it, but because water, despite its shimmer, could no longer be trusted the same way. Ale offered predictability, a sort of domestic promise. Fire had touched it, time had shaped it, hands had stirred it. It had been watched and waited for. So when the child reached for the mug, when the father poured another cup, when the grandmother sipped before closing the shutters, they weren't thinking of history or health. In the low light of the cottage, where the fire never quite died and the rafters smelled of wood smoke and thyme, there was always one person who understood how to keep everything moving quietly forward. She was the alewife. Not by title, not by proclamation, but by daily rhythm. She brewed not for ceremony or celebration, but for the sake of the house. Because someone had to, because water could not be trusted. She let it cool. That part always took longer than she expected. Sometimes it was a bit of foam from the last batch, saved in a jar beside the chimney. She checked now and then, not because she doubted, but because watching was part of the work. This was not a task you could rush. It was a partnership between time and care. Sometimes she trusted the air, knowing the yeasts would come. They always had. The air was alive with them. She just needed patience. There was no labeling, no counting of days. She knew by memory, by instinct. It was what you gave to those you loved, because you wanted them to wake well the next day. A small sign, a switch of twigs, a bit of cloth might be hung outside the door to say there was ale for sale. Only the feel of the spoon in her hand, the weight of the mash, the sound of the pot as it began to bubble. She passed this knowledge not through words, but by letting the next generation watch. A daughter, perhaps, stirring too fast at first. A niece, wrinkling her nose at the yeast. But they would learn, slowly, by standing close, by repeating. The ale was just one more thread in the fabric of daily life, like tending the fire or patching the hem of a child's shirt. Watch the same bubbles at the edge of the vessel, and the cycle would continue. But it mattered. It mattered because she remembered the stories. She remembered the sickness that came when water was taken from the wrong well, when it had not been boiled, when the rain had stirred up the filth beneath the ground. Just for a moment, on the low stool near the hearth, hands in her lap, eyes half closed. The room would be warm, still smelling faintly of grain and smoke. Outside, the light would shift gently against the wall. Neighbors would come quietly. A few coins, a loaf of bread in trade, a short word about weather or sore knees. Just letting the stillness settle. A day's quiet work completed. The fire tended, the ale resting. And in that small moment, everything was enough. Then the door would close and the quiet would return. Because the water from the stream outside was still too much of a gamble. She knew how long it would last, and how much the family would drink before it turned. Not always with joy, but always with intention, because someone had to watch over the small things, the invisible things, the quiet dangers that others had forgotten, but she had not. And so she moved about the rest of the kitchen, feeding chickens, kneading dough, watching the morning grow brighter through the small square window. It was early, often before the sky turned fully blue. She would rise, pull her shawl close, and fetch water in pails that groaned slightly with each step. The great pot was filled and hung over the flame. It wasn't a feast smell, not sweet or spiced, but it was comforting. It clung to the walls, to the apron, to the long wooden spoon. The children recognized it. The dog dozing near the door recognized it too. It meant the drink was coming. Grain, if there was enough, was measured by feel, not by scale. Barley was best. Oats would do. Sometimes wheat if the harvest had been kind. She stirred slowly, clockwise, always clockwise, her hand steady from habit more than thought. The well was not far, but the walk always felt longer when the air still held night's hush. She moved without hurry. The task was old. The path had been walked 1,000 times, in shoes that remembered each stone. Inside, the hearth would be glowing faintly. She stirred the coals, added a small log, and watched the sparks rise like sleepy fireflies. Then she began. The mash thickened. The scent deepened. The room filled with the soft aroma of wet grain and warming earth. Once the boil had passed, and the grains had released what they could, she strained the liquid through a warm cloth or a basket lined with dry herbs. The ale sat in its vessel, quiet. When it reached the right warmth, she added yeast. Fermentation was not noisy. It was a stillness that shifted slightly, a scent that turned, a few small bubbles along the edge. When the ale was ready, it was ladled into jugs or stored in small barrels tucked beneath the cool stone ledge at the back of the house. The children drank it with meals. The husband drank it after work. Guests were offered a mug without comment. It was not a drink of status or surprise. On Sundays, when there was enough grain to spare, she would brew more than the family needed. She did not think of herself as a brewer. There were no lectures, no gatherings, no awards. She simply kept the house safe. And so she brewed. Through winter frost and spring rains, through long harvest days and dim candlelit evenings, she kept to the rhythm. There were no instructions, only memory. And one day, they would rise early too. They would carry the same pails, stir the same grains. She didn't call it legacy. She called it Tuesday. She called it something that simply needed doing. And when the brewing was done, and the mash had been fed to the pigs, and the last jug sealed, she would sit. She would sit there, not thinking, not planning. In quiet homes where the fire rarely died, the mug of ale was passed with the same gentleness as a folded blanket or a slice of fresh bread. It was given to the child without fanfare, and to the elder without question. It was not a luxury, nor was it rare. When their teeth were just coming in, and the porridge was too thick to swallow alone, a little ale was spooned in to soften the meal. When a child was restless, or a winter cough came, a sip of warm ale might calm the breath. There was no ceremony in this. It was what was done. And the child grew up not thinking of ale as drink or medicine, but simply as something that was always there. It was the echo of earlier days when they had stirred the pot themselves, or fetched water from the stream, or sat beside a child with a spoonful of froth. Now their hands trembled slightly as they held the cup, perhaps in silence, both holding their cups while the fire flickered. The elder's mug might be worn smooth by decades of use, while the child still had rough edges and fingerprints in the clay, but the ale inside was the same. It carried no weight of tradition, yet it was tradition itself. When broth was too thin and milk had turned, the ale remained. It was not a cure, but it did not harm. Not to impress, not to experiment, but to serve. Few toasts, few explanations. It was not something one thanked the heavens for. It was something one expected, like the presence of bread or the creak of the door in the evening wind. To make something that would be gentle for a small belly and calming for a tired one. The alewife brewed for everyone in the home, and she thought of them all as she stirred. Nothing more was needed. The ale had done its work. It had connected one hand to another. It had softened the day's edges. It had filled the space between the very young and the very old with something warm, something simple, something safe. The baby, the farmer, the old woman who could no longer walk to the doorway. Each had their place at the table. Each would drink from the same pot. And that, in a world of uncertain waters and sudden fevers, was enough. It was light, boiled, familiar, strong enough to nourish, mild enough not to overwhelm. It belonged to no age, and to all ages at once. Their sips were smaller, but the ale tasted the same. It tasted like steadiness. Ale was brought. When an elder fell asleep by the fire, a mug rested near their hand. When someone returned from the fields or from a long walk to market, the jug was waiting. Always the same jug. Always the same simple taste. It was simply part of the day, the table, the rhythm of things. It warmed more than the hands. It was kindness. Water turned cold in the jug and could sting the throat. When the chores were finished and the fire settled into a red glow, the mugs were filled one last time. One for the child, drowsy-eyed and blinking slowly. One for the elder, wrapped in layers, watching the shadows shift across the wall. No one hurried. The mugs were held, sipped, set down. Ale, kept close to the hearth, stayed drinkable. It helped the food settle. It soothed the cough. It softened the quiet. Nor did they drink to celebrate. They drank because it was comforting, because the ale did not ask anything of them. It did not require sharpness of taste or clarity of mind. It only needed a moment of stillness, a small breath before sleep, a sip after a cough. The ale did not pretend to be youth. It honored age, by not demanding more than the elder could give. Carved from soft wood or molded from clay, it fit awkwardly in their hand. The ale was mild, pale, thin, and warm. The child listened, not always understanding, but feeling the comfort of rhythm and tone. The elder spoke with pauses, letting the words breathe, letting the past stretch gently into the present. Between words, a sip. Between memories, the warmth of the mug against the palm. Slightly larger, slightly heavier. The ale changed as well, becoming a touch richer, a little deeper in color, with more weight on the tongue. They came to recognize the variations. When barley was scarce, or when the brewing had gone slightly off. They noticed, but they did not judge. Each batch was accepted. Each mug was drunk slowly, patiently, as if tasting not just the ale, but the day itself. Barely fermented, low in strength, but full of care. It had no bitterness, no burn, no sense of risk. The child did not wince at the taste, but accepted it as they accepted bread or broth or the scent of the hearth. It reminded each person, no matter their age, that they were part of the house. Children were introduced to ale early, often before they even knew the word for it. The first mug a child held was usually a small one. No one watched closely to see how the child drank. There was no milestone, no rite of passage. It was not about growing up, but about belonging. The mug was not given because they were ready, but because it was their turn. A small hand around a simple cup, a quiet sip before sleep. No praise, no warning, just a continuation of what had always been done. As the children grew, so too did their mugs. For the elders, the ale was something different. It was memory. The elder did not drink to forget. In many homes, there were moments when the child and the elder drank at the same time. Sometimes the ale was offered before a story, a tale told slowly, with the hush of evening around it. In winter, when the wind pushed against the shutters and the ground outside lay stiff with frost, ale was more than habit. The sick drank it, not always gladly, but often gratefully. When nothing else stayed down, the ale might. Brewing was done with this in mind. Some might say it was strange that young and old drank the same thing. But the ale had been shaped to fit the needs of both. When a child cried, there were few words said about it. And when the day drew to a close, in the silence that followed, there were some who believed that ale brewed by moonlight tasted softer, not sweeter, not stronger, just ... quieter, as if the light of the moon, filtered through the wooden shutters or caught gently on the rim of the brewing pot, gave the ale a different kind of patience. But sometimes, when the days were too full or the grain had been soaked too late, the process drifted into the evening. And in those times, when the world slowed and sound became scarce, some alewives preferred to brew beneath the moon. It wasn't superstition. It was simply the kind of thought that rose when you worked alone at night, when the house had gone still and the fire gave off only the faintest glow. Most brewing happened in the early hours of day, while dew clung to grass and the chickens had not yet stirred. She would watch the first lazy bubbles rise, a sign that the invisible work had begun. Then she might rest, sitting beside it, not sleeping, but simply letting herself pause. It changed the color of things. The ale looked paler, the spoon darker, the steam more silver than white. In the light of morning, it would taste the same. But for the alewife, the memory of how it was made lingered. She would remember the feel of the steam on her face, the way the moonlight curved around the edge of the jug, the sound of nothing at all while she stirred. No one tested these claims. They were never written down. But enough people believed them that the practice continued. But on those evenings when everything aligned, when the house was clean, the pot scrubbed, the grain fresh, a daughter might learn by waking unexpectedly, finding her mother hunched quietly over the pot, steam rising like a ghost beside her. She might sit without a word, watching, sensing that something important was happening, even if she did not yet understand what. And the moon full, the brewing seemed to carry a kind of grace, a slow practice within a slow life. It required no tools that weren't already present. It needed no ingredients beyond grain, water, and time, but it offered something extra, a sense of gentleness, a sense of care made deeper by the hour. She would not be able to say why, only that it felt right, that the night had something to offer the ale. Its shape did not seem to matter, only its presence, only the feeling that one was not alone, even in the quietest part of the night, that she felt closer to her work when the world was still. Whether true or not, it was a pleasing thought. And in a world shaped by routine and repetition, even small variations were welcome. She might hold the wooden spoon in her hands and look at the patch of moonlight resting on the floor. She might breathe in the scent of wet grain and hearth smoke. She might close her eyes, just for a while. The moon gave permission to move slowly, to take one's time, to be alone without being lonely. Even the fire seemed to understand that it must burn gently, not too high, and rewarded them with calmer hearts. That the ale carried a bit of that calmness. But in that moment, she was alone with her work, with the quiet, with the moon. And something in the stillness would stay with the ale, as it always had. That the ones who drank it would not know why they felt at ease, only that something in the cup seemed gentler than usual. In such a setting, the act of brewing felt less like labor and more like ritual. And those who brewed by night often did so not just from necessity, but by choice. None of this mattered to the brewing itself, of course, but it mattered to the mood. And mood was part of the process. The kitchen was a different place by night. Shadows stretched longer. The heat of the hearth was more noticeable, the flicker of firelight more golden. The brewing tools, the spoon, the basin, a heavy pot, took on a gentler presence. No longer just instruments of work, they became quiet companions in a room that felt half asleep. The alewife moved slowly, not because she was tired, but because the night asked for stillness. The pails of water steamed as they met the bottom of the pot. The grain was poured in without sound. She stirred with care, mindful of the silence, letting the rhythm of the motion soothe her as much as it stirred the mash. There were no children underfoot, no doors opening and closing, no tasks calling from the yard. It was just the fire, the grain, the water, and the slow passage of time. The alewife could hum, if she wanted to, or she could simply listen to the soft popping of the mash, to the night wind against the roof, to her own breath moving in and out. Sometimes the moonlight slipped through the small window, resting in patches on the floor or catching in the sheen of bubbling liquid. The night brewing brought with it a kind of privacy that daylight didn't allow. Fermentation, too, began in quiet. Once the mash had been strained and poured into the waiting vessel, she would set it close to the hearth to stay warm. There were stories, whispered rather than spoken, about moon-brewed ale being more stable, that it soured less quickly, or calmed the stomach more easily. It was a moment of solitude, in a life where solitude was rare. The rest of the house dreamed quietly. The animals stirred in their sleep. The ale itself was no different. Some said the moonlight brought dreams. That ale brewed under its gaze encouraged deeper sleep, longer rest. Others believed the moon was a kind of watcher, that it noticed those who worked in the quiet hours. Of course, not every night was right for brewing. The wind could be too sharp, the fire too fussy. No one spoke of this aloud. There were no rules, no instructions. Only the passing of knowledge through silence. And when that daughter brewed years later, she might find herself drawn to the same hour. The moon changed, of course. Sometimes it was a sliver, barely visible. Sometimes it filled the sky like a second sun. In this way, brewing by moonlight became a secret rhythm. And when the brewing was done, and the fire banked, and the last vessel set aside to rest, the alewife might sit for a moment longer, The ale would be ready in the morning. The house would stir. Life would return to its pace. There was a village nestled between two slow-moving hills, where the streams did not run fast and the wells never quite filled to the brim. The earth was gentle but not generous, and though the trees bore fruit in season, and the fields gave grain when tended with care, there was always a quiet uncertainty about water. They simply knew it as something that hovered, like mist in the lowlands. It never shouted, never struck, but always lingered just close enough to remind them it was there. The fields could turn dry. The streams could turn thin. The well could echo a little louder than it should. Some days it came clear. Some days it came clouded. Always it came slow. And what they made, more than anything else, was ale. Like a plant watered not when wilted, but just before. "You drink ale all day?" they would ask, their eyebrows raised. And the well was not deep, and the rain could forget them for weeks. But the ale could be trusted. The ale was made at home, in firelight and patience. It answered a question that no one wanted to ask aloud. What if the water turns again? And the villagers would smile, not quite understanding the question. But the intention was the same. Make enough to keep everyone well. A mug left at the doorstep. A jug swapped for herbs or help with mending. No one was outside the circle. Grains soaked, pots cleaned, fires fed. Even in winter, when the air bit hard and the daylight was brief, the process continued. They came to understand the signs, the way the mash changed color, the scent of good yeast, the feel of the vessel when it was just warm enough. These things were not taught with words, but passed through hands, sometimes thinner, sometimes stretched with a bit of old bread or root. But still it came. Still it filled the mugs. And still it kept the people steady. A little slower, perhaps, a little quieter, but steady, always steady, not carved in stone, but alive in muscle and memory. As long as someone remembered to stir, the village would not thirst. If you lived in the village, you drank. If you drank, you belonged. Just 1,000 small mugs, used and washed and used again, and the sound of quiet satisfaction as each one was emptied. A child's mug with a chip at the rim. A farmer's mug stained from years of use. A grandmother's mug kept near the window where the light fell soft in the morning. All these mugs told the same story. We have what we need. No more, but no less. And as long as someone remembered how, the village would be all right. And so, even in lean years, no one went dry. As natural as sleep, as common as sunrise. The ale was not magic, and it was not sacred, but it was enough. Even when the rains paused and the soil cracked, no one went dry. We drink what we brew, they would say. We drink what does not make us sick. The ale was light, steady, expected. It passed from one hand to another, without thought, like bread or firewood. No one hoarded it. No one feared its absence. A jug would be placed at the center of the table, and hands would reach without hurry. Stories might be shared, or silence kept. Either was welcome. What mattered was the presence of others, and of the drink that had come from their own work. It was simply there. The villagers did not speak of thirst as a threat, only the steady sip of something trusted. And in this quiet routine, the village grew strong. Not in muscle, not in wealth, but in continuity. A kind of strength that comes from never having to worry, at least not about thirst. The pots were blackened from use, the strainers stained from grain, but everything was clean in the way that matters. Clean from attention, clean from care. So, over time, they learned to rely not on the streams or the well, but on what they could make with their hands. Not ale as indulgence, not ale as escape, but ale as water, made safer. Boiled, cooled, fermented, and watched. The elderly never coughed from parched throats. When the midday sun pressed hard on the roofs, and the dust stirred in the air, The people still moved with calm. There was always a mug nearby, always a jug within reach. It became the quiet foundation of the village, not because anyone declared it so, but because it worked. And when something works, gently and without harm, it stays. Each cottage brewed its own, sometimes alone, sometimes shared. There were no grand cellars or deep vats, just small batches, enough for the week. In this village, children never cried from dry mouths. It wasn't that they were never thirsty, but the thirst was met before it grew sharp. Visitors sometimes found it odd, because the streams were not cruel, but they were unreliable. So the brewing became more than habit. It became language. Each family had its own small methods, its own grain mix, its own timing. The mug became a symbol, not of abundance, but of enough. There was no toast, no cheer. The ale did more than hydrate. It gathered people. At midday rest, at evening hush, after work and before sleep. Even those too old to brew were still given a share. Neighbors brought it without being asked. And the brewing itself never stopped. It moved like a wheel. As one batch was drunk, another was started. Children grew up learning the steps not through instruction, but through repetition. They watched, stirred, waited, and so the knowledge remained, not written in books. Even in bad years, when the harvest was light and the nights long, the ale was made. There were no great celebrations, no festivals of ale, only the quiet knowing that, as long as the pot could be set on the fire, and so the village continued. The seasons turned, the children grew, the elders passed, but the brewing stayed. And in a world where not everything could be trusted, where rain could fail, and soil could sour, and promises could break, that meant more than anyone said aloud. There was no monument to it, no stone to mark its gift, a village without thirst. Not because of miracles, but because of memory, and hands, and fire, and patience. There was a quiet understanding in the village. Ale did not begin with boiling or stirring. It began with grain, and grain began with the season. Long before the pot was set on the fire, before the yeast was coaxed into life, before the jug was filled, there was the field. They did not ask it to hurry. They knew it would do what it had always done, change slowly. The earth would rest under frost, then soften under rain. The sun would return, higher each day, warming the surface until it was ready to take seed. And the field had its own slow story. The soil, still dark from snowmelt, gave off a scent that mixed dampness with promise, but by sense. One morning, a slower, the grain rested. Not for long, too, the subtleties of grain. A double soak, a longer boil, a batch left to ferment just a little longer. Spring batches were lighter, brewed from stored grain and cautious air. Summer batches held more life, sometimes a bit wild, as yeast worked faster in the warmth. Autumn ales were sturdy, fuller, made from fresh grain. Winter ales were slow, darker, brewed when the house was still and time was plentiful. These were quiet indulgences, shared without fuss. A neighbor might nod after a sip and say, "This one's got depth," and that would be enough. One could tell the year by the taste, by the feel on the tongue, by the way it lingered. It was not precise, but it was real. How barley brewed clearer, how oats made for a softer drink, how rye gave it bite. Each house had its preference, each brewer their small adjustments. Some toasted the grain before soaking, some added a pinch of dried herbs, but none forgot the source. Not spoken aloud, not shared, but real. A silent thank you to the land, to the season, to the rhythm that had not yet failed them. The grain came from season. And in that circle, the village turned. Not quickly, not perfectly, but steadily. The ale came from grain. There was the memory of soil underfoot, of hands scattering seed, of sun-warmed stalks moving in unison. There was season, there was grain, There was enough, but long enough to settle, to find its cool place in the back of a cottage or beneath a cellar stone. And then, piece by piece, it would be taken for brewing. A scoop here, a handful there. Never too much at once. Enough for the next batch. Enough for the house. Dustier task. The grain was separated from the chaff, often with the help of wind or slow-turning drums. Paler, less generous in warmth. But it was still brewed. It still passed from jug to mug. It still did what it needed to do. Nourish, calm, sustain. Children joined in, if only for the rhythm of it. They laughed sometimes, as grain scattered or husks stuck to their hair. But they understood the importance. This was what the ale came from. This was the beginning. Someone would say, "It's time," not because a rule had been followed, but because the grain had turned just enough. The color was right. The sound it made when the wind passed was different. The plants no longer bent as easily. And so, they began. Not because they expected perfection, but because they trusted the process. Sides moved in long arcs. Arms repeated the same motions without complaint. There was no celebration. Not yet. Just focus. The grain was gathered into bundles, tied, and left to dry. The sun did the rest. The air thickened with scent, dry stalks, warm soil, the faint trace of coming rain. The grain would grow, more or less. And when it did, there would be ale. The wind moved through them like a low song. The grain stood taller now, golden in the light, full but not yet ready. Villagers walked the edge of the plots in the late afternoons, checking the heads of barley, touching the stalks as they passed. Under their own sky. It had been turned by their own hands. And it would, soon enough, become the ale that filled their cups and kept their bodies strong when water could not be trusted. Not rushing, just acknowledging, just keeping watch. Small groups moved across the land, scattering seed by hand, barley, mostly. Oats when barley was short. The children watched them with a kind of patience that surprised even themselves. It was one thing to drink from a mug. It was another to see the very beginnings of what filled it. They understood, in a quiet way, that grain was not just food. It was possibility. Rye when the weather had been difficult the year before. They did not measure by rows or tools. They measured by feel, the sweep of an arm, the memory of last year's yield, the knowledge passed from parent to child. The villagers watched the land not with urgency, but with the kind of attention that comes from repetition. In early spring, the fields were quiet but restless. Spring was not a time for certainty. Some seeds would fail. Some birds would take too much. But still they sowed. As the season turned, the green shoots appeared, shy at first, then bolder. By summer, the fields had changed. Harvest came not by clock. The work was steady. Threshing followed. Once dried and stored, the villagers treated the grain with a kind of quiet respect. It was not sacred, but it was essential. It had grown in their own soil, they learned. In lean years, when storms came late or sun too early, the brewing adjusted. The ale might be thinner. In good years, when the harvest was full and the bins overflowed, there was time to experiment. The seasons were never identical. Each brought its own shape to the ale. The villagers did not keep records. They did not need to. The knowledge lived in practice, in repetition, in shared memory. The connection between grain and mug was never broken. The children who scattered seed would one day stir mash. The elders who drank would remember planting. There were moments, walking past a golden field in late summer, when someone might pause and feel something close to gratitude. And when the mug was lifted, warm in the hand, cool on the lips, there was more than ale inside. In every quiet corner of the village, there lingered a memory of water that had once betrayed them. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow way that troubles arrive in old places. They drew it carefully, and stored it with quiet reverence. But more often than not, they turned instead to ale, not because they loved it more, but because it harmed them less. A foul taste, a strange smell, an illness that passed from child to child without ever showing its face. The well that had once seemed bottomless turned brackish. The stream that ran through the edge of the woods began to dry by midsummer. The rain that fell was no longer enough to trust. And so, over years and then decades, the villagers stopped relying on the water alone. They boiled it when they could. They let it settle. No one tore down the wells or built temples to ale. The old illnesses that had swept through quietly now passed them by. The weak stomachs grew strong. The restless sleep turned to calm. And the people, though they barely noticed, became sturdier. But over time, the rhythm shifted. At meals, at work, during rest, the mug of ale was what appeared. It waited, warm or cool, in the dark jug near the hearth. The ale did not need reminding. It did not depend on season or generosity. It was theirs. Not a gift, but a craft. Not a mystery, but a memory preserved in grain. A sip could loosen cold fingers. A cup could steady the stomach after too little food. Not because of tradition alone, but because of memory. Because ale had filled the place where trust in water had once lived. By scent, by sound. And somehow, this gave the ale a personality that water never had. A warmth that came not from temperature, but from memory. It had stepped in quietly, without demand, and offered steadiness. It gave consistency. It gave calm. It gave something that had been made, not simply found. And in that act of making, of tending, of transforming, the villagers found more than drink. They found trust. Water, then, was locked beneath ice. The stream was silent. The well, unreachable. You could not ignore the boil. You had to be there, in body and in care. The ale would not punish mistakes, but it would remember them. The fire would be lit. The pot set on. The grain stirred. And the ale would come again, slow and sure, with its quiet promise. You are not alone. It seemed to say, you have done this before. You will do this again. And that was enough. Of years when the well turned black, when travelers fell ill after drinking too quickly. Only a quiet shift in the way things were done. Water still had its place, but ale had taken the center. Not for celebration, but for survival, when a single sip led to weeks of coughing. These stories were not meant to alarm. They were meant to remind. And when the first sip of a new batch touched the tongue, there was always a quiet moment of recognition. This is ours, it said. This is safe. The villagers did not forget what water had failed to give them. They respected it still. They washed with it, cooled their faces in it, watched the rain with gratitude. But they did not turn to it first when thirst came. The mug waited, as it always had, close to the fire. Children were no longer told to fetch water, but to fetch the jug. That what is natural is not always safe. That what is made with care can sometimes offer more than what is given freely. The ale was humble. It did not claim to be perfect. But it did what it was supposed to do, and that was enough. Guests were offered the brew, not the bucket. Illness faded, and strength returned. Water, after all, had become a stranger. Ale was something they made with their own hands. It was not that the water was cursed. It still shimmered in the light, still made puddles after rain. The days when water was all they knew, and sickness came with no explanation. They would sit with their mugs now, in the long, slow afternoons, and think of how much had changed without fuss. They did not say much about it, but they knew. Children still jumped in it when the days were hot, but no one drank from the stream anymore, not directly, not without caution. It did not ask for faith in the land's mood. It did not turn bitter in a week of sun. It did not carry illness in its invisible depths. It was made by the same hands that would drink it, and that made all the difference. The old ways had been too generous, and they had learned slowly, and suddenly, that nature could be forgetful. The water, yes, taken from the same uncertain well, but boiled and cooled, watched and stirred, transformed into something else. Something safe, something familiar. Ale gave what water could not: consistency. It answered to fire and grain, not cloud or thaw. There was a kind of peace in knowing where each part had come from, the grain, grown in nearby fields. And so, little by little, the mug replaced the ladle. It was not a revolution. No one announced it. The village did not grow wealthy from this change, nor famous. It simply continued, more comfortably than before. Even in years when the well improved, when the stream flowed fuller, the trust had shifted. There was a lesson here, though no one gave it a name. In winter, when the snow came fast and the wind pulled hard at the shutters, the ale kept its place. It did not freeze. It did not sour. Even in summer, when the rains returned and the buckets filled quickly, the village remembered. Some elders remembered the times before the ale was common. There were stories, of course. Not frightening ones, not the kind told to stir fear, but quiet recollections. And so the brewing continued. The process was simple, but it required presence, attention, a kind of patience that water did not ask for. You could not rush the mash. The villagers learned to make it without thinking, the way one learns to walk paths they've taken since childhood. They did not measure often. They judged by feel. The mugs they used were not precious. Many were cracked. Some had been passed down for years, but they held the ale with familiarity. There were no sermons, no declarations. What the water couldn't give, the ale did. Even now, when the air turned dry or the wells whispered empty, there was no fear. In every home across the village, whether grand or modest, one would always find a jug near the hearth. It did not matter if the house had been built with skillful hands or stood leaning with age. The same quiet rule applied. In the same way that the fire was not only heat, and the chair not only a seat, the jug offered more than what it contained. It gave reassurance. It held time. Its presence by the hearth suggested that all was well, or at least as well as it needed to be. It was where meals were cooked, where hands were warmed, where the first light of the day appeared and the last embers of evening glowed. The hearth gave shape to the room, not just physically but emotionally. Around it, people gathered. Around it, the jug waited. The heat from the fire would keep the ale inside from cooling too fast. It was a quiet kind of cooperation. The jug did not need much, not because anyone told them, but because they saw it always in the same place. They would watch as their mothers stirred the mash, as their fathers lifted mugs with care, as older siblings wiped the jug's mouth before pouring. It was a kind of language, spoken not with words, but with familiarity. It simply liked to be near warmth. It liked to be where the voices gathered, and the hands passed cups back and forth. It continued to appear beside the hearth, dependable as ever. Its presence signaled that life was continuing, quietly, without interruption. The jug lived close to the fire. It was not commanded to stay there, but it always did. Still, the jug stayed close. Even without the need for heat, it knew its place. There was no need to move it far. They did not drink quickly. They sipped slowly, as if the mug contained not just ale, but memory itself. And in many ways, it did. Some homes brewed more often. Others shared with neighbors. But the jug always found its way back to its place, not because it distracted from grief, but because it held familiarity. When the world felt unsteady, the jug reminded the people of all that had not changed. It gave them something to hold on to, something that would not ask questions, something that would not leave. It was a lived practice, born of repetition and quiet understanding. It was not prized for its rarity. It was prized for its reliability. Not hot, not boiled, just close enough to feel the hearth's breath. Whether true or not, few disputed the comfort it brought. A baby's first smile, a repaired door, the return of someone gone too long. These moments were marked not by grand feasts, but by warm mugs shared beside the fire. The jug did not lift itself in toast. It did not demand laughter. It simply offered itself, as it always had. A mug drawn from a warm jug had a softness to it, but always the hearth remained, and near it the jug. Even when new families moved in, or strangers passed through, they felt the rhythm. They knew, instinctively, where to sit, what to reach for. It settled more kindly in the belly, especially when night had fallen and wind tapped softly at the shutters. It had become part of the pattern, part of the way the home breathed. Maybe they would wipe the rim. Maybe they would simply leave it there, content to let it wait in the dark, close to the embers. And the rhythm, unshaken, would continue. That was how things were, and how they had always been. And for this village, that was more than enough. They did not draw attention, but they offered something deeper than notice. They offered continuity. They were shown to the hearth and handed a mug. The jug was passed, not spoken about. It did not need explanation. Its weight in the hand was its own kind of welcome. No one asked what it held. They knew. In a world that changed with seasons and storms, that brought illness and joy in equal measure, there was something deeply soothing about finding the jug in the same place each day. And somehow, life moved more gently around it, passed from mother to daughter, from father to son. The stories of these jugs were not written down. They were remembered through use. A stain on the side from a spilled herb, a faint crack that never quite split, the slight lean of the handle after years of pouring. These small details became part of the household's memory. The jug was never just a vessel. It was part of the rhythm. Many jugs had no decorations. They were shaped from clay and hardened in simple kilns. Some had small nicks or smooth curves, where hands had worn them down through the years. A few had been glazed in earlier times, when someone had extra coin or a reason to impress. Most were plain. They were not made to be admired. They were made to be used, and used often. The hearth was the other constant. Every cottage, no matter how small, made space for it. The two were rarely apart. In the early mornings, the jug would still be cool, having sat quietly through the night. As the fire was coaxed back to life, and the smoke curled softly into the chimney, someone would reach for the jug. They might pour a small mug to sip while sitting on a low stool, watching the day begin. Nothing was rushed. That first drink was part of the rising. Later in the day, the jug would be moved closer, especially in colder months. Children grew up knowing that the jug belonged there. Even in times of scarcity, when grain was low and batches were thinner, the jug remained. It might hold less, but it held nonetheless. In summer, when the days were long and the sun poured in through the shutters, the fire was lower, more cautious. There were homes where the jug had sat for decades. Some villagers believed the ale tasted better when warmed gently by the fire. The jug and the hearth were never loud. When guests came to visit, they were not met with fanfare. Elders, especially, seemed drawn to it. They would sit nearest the fire, sometimes nodding off in the warmth, the jug at arm's reach. There were no rules about how often the jug should be filled or emptied. In times of sorrow, such as after loss or failed harvest, the jug became even more central. Likewise, in small celebrations, it stood with quiet dignity. And so the years moved on, and the village grew older. Some cottages fell and were rebuilt. Some jugs were broken and replaced. It was not a tradition, at least not in the way books describe such things. It was not written, not taught in lessons. At night, when the fire dimmed and the house grew still, someone would glance at the jug one last time before sleep. Maybe they would top it up. Tomorrow would bring its own needs. its own small struggles and blessings. But whatever came, the jug would be waiting. The hearth would be warm again. There is a kind of flavor that does not arrive with flair. It does not bloom suddenly or vanish in a breath. It stays. It lingers just enough to be remembered, then quietly recedes like the last note of a lullaby. It is not dramatic. They had long ago learned that excitement rarely brought peace. Instead, they chose calm. They chose warmth. The ale changed with the season, and they welcomed that. In spring, it tasted soft, almost cautious, as if the cold had not quite left. In summer, it was brighter, fuller, touched by the heat that ripened the barley. Autumn brought earthier notes, stronger and rounder. And winter gave them dark ale, deep and slow, meant to last. Just enough to understand that this drink was part of the rhythm. Not in harsh terms, but with care. This one's a little sharp, someone might say. The yeast, invisible and alive, worked in silence. And when the time came, the ale was poured into jugs, set near the hearth, and allowed to wait. Nothing about it asked to be rushed. Or, let it rest another day next time. The ale taught them patience, taught them to listen without judgment, taught them to pay attention to the quiet things, and poured with intention. That someone had taken the time to make something steady in a world that could be uncertain. No toasts, no dances. The ale seemed to wrap around the body more slowly. The villagers would add a cloth to the jug to keep it from chilling too quickly. Sometimes they'd set it just close enough to the hearth to draw a little warmth. Not to boil, not even to heat, just to keep it from forgetting the fire. And in that cup, they found continuity. They found a connection to the harvest, to the hands that stirred, to the earth that grew the grain. They found a taste that reminded them they had done this before and would do it again. Just mugs passed hand to hand? Just sips taken in silence or over soft conversation? Just the knowledge that this batch, like the last, was enough. Like the quiet nod of someone sitting beside you. It was not strong. One might take a mug and sit in the doorway, watching the last of the light fade behind the hills. The ale did not speak. It did not entertain. But in its warmth, one could feel the day settle into place. They took a sip, paused, and waited for something dramatic, but nothing came. Only a slow warmth. Only a soft breath at the end of the swallow. And then confusion. Was that all? No songs, no carved symbols. It did not need ceremony. Its presence was its meaning. Its taste was its story. And so they drank, without rush, without expectation. They drank not to celebrate a moment, but to inhabit it more fully. The ale reminded them to be here, to notice the light on the wall, to listen to the breath of someone across the room, to feel the wood of the mug against the palm. The villagers only smiled. That was all yes, and that was plenty. There was a kind of strength in that subtlety, one that did not need to declare itself. Two was flavor, not just what touched the tongue, but what filled the space between people. The sound of liquid poured, the warmth of firelight on clay, the soft, steady act of drinking something made with patience. To outsiders, the flavor might seem small. But to the villagers, it was the taste of everything they needed. It was the taste of rhythm, of memory, of belonging, the taste of a quiet life. The ale did not promise courage or energy or laughter, but it gave ease. It gave the feeling of settling in. It gave the sense that things were in their place. It was not weak. It was simply itself, not for celebration alone, not for forgetting, but for being part of the day. They chose the taste that reminded them of home, of quiet evenings by the fire, of hands folded in stillness after a long day. They found a rhythm outside of urgency, a pace that respected time instead of defying it. The taste of the ale, when finally sipped, carried all of that within it. Their ale reflected that choice. It was drunk slowly, with quiet recognition. And next time, adjustments would be made. A pinch more grain, a slower fire. But no one blamed the ale. No one cursed the brew. The villagers understood that not every effort produced the same result. And that was fine. It is not rich. It is familiar. It is steady. That was the flavor of their ale. The villagers did not seek excitement in their mugs. No two mugs ever tasted exactly the same. A slight difference in the grain, a bit more fire, a longer rest. Each season gave the ale a voice, not loud, not distinct, but familiar, like someone humming the same melody in a different key. At the midday rest, with a bowl of root stew. At the evening fire, after tools were set aside. At weddings, when families gathered close. At quiet funerals, where grief needed something to soften its edge. It stood on tables and in hands, warm or cool, and it never demanded attention. It simply offered itself. They did not describe the ale in words meant to impress. They said things like smooth or cool on the back of the tongue, or like last year's batch, but gentler. Those words were enough. No one needed more. The ale was not there to be analyzed. It was there to be present. And it was always present. Children grew up around the taste. They were not given mugs of their own, not right away, but they were allowed a sip now and then. They learned the difference between a good batch and one that needed work. The brewing was never hurried. It could not be. The grain soaked at its own pace. The mash thickened in its own way. In that slowness, the villagers found something rare. It tasted like still mornings and fading light, like warmth spreading through the hands and belly. Visitors to the village sometimes did not understand. They expected more from their drink. More bite, more fire. Even the flawed batches were kept. If a jug turned too sour or too thin, it was not thrown away. What mattered was that the ale had been made with care, that it had been stirred, watched, cooled. There was no celebration at the end of a successful brew. When the evenings grew long and the fires burned lower, the ale became part of the silence. In the colder months, there were no festivals built around the ale. As the sky deepened and the last colors of twilight faded behind the hills, the village slipped into stillness. The evening had softened every edge. Sounds that filled the day gave way to silence. The shadows had grown deeper, stretching into corners and resting gently on stone floors. In that hush, a familiar ritual began. Nothing official, nothing announced. Just a small movement repeated night after night, the pouring of a final cup of ale before sleep. The wind moved more slowly now, brushing against rooftops and quiet hedgerows like an old memory returning. Others sat by a window, the stars barely visible beyond the faint mist rising across the fields. Still others moved through their small tasks, folding cloth or putting away spoons, their fingers curling around the mug between gestures. The kind that doesn't feel empty, but complete. A silence that listens more than it speaks. The house seemed to lean into it, beams relaxing, stone walls cooling, hearth sighing in orange light. Others held the mug for minutes before lifting it to their lips. The rhythm varied, but always led toward rest. It was not about taste. It was about transition. Inside the cottages, the fire was no longer a blaze, but a gentle glow. The wood hissed only occasionally. Yet they grew up within its presence. The stillness of that moment seeped into them like the smell of hearthwood or the texture of linen. They might not have known the meaning, but they carried the memory, just set gently, as if marking the final line of a poem. Nothing more was needed. The day had spoken. The walls held in the faint scent of earth and wood smoke. Only the moon knew how many eyes had already closed, how many chests rose and fell in deep, slow breath. Feet moved quietly across worn floorboards. Doors creaked only slightly. The night accepted every sound and turned it into hush. But across the village, This shared pause bound people together, not in words or glances, but in a common surrender to the end of day. The jug sat nearby, mostly empty, its sides catching the last of the glow, a witness to all the quiet things that made life steady. Not the triumphs, not the losses, but the breath in between, for whatever the heart needed to carry or let go. But inside these cottages, at this hour, the world knew how to rest. And the cup, small, warm, familiar, helped guide it there, one gentle evening at a time. It would not be clean tonight. It would not be disturbed. Morning would come. It always did. Even when taken alone, the ritual was not lonely. It was rooted in something larger, a pattern repeated over generations. In the way fingers curved around clay, in the way eyes softened, in the way stillness wrapped the body like a second blanket, just long enough to remind those within it that sleep was not an escape. It was a return. It was not the quantity that counted, but the moment itself, a soft pause, a slowing of breath, a gesture without weight, but full of meaning. It offered only a gentle hand on the shoulder, a nod, a soft descent into the folds of night. The mug was simple, often the same one used for years, not because there was more to drink, but because letting go felt unnecessary, as natural as sleep, as quiet as dusk, as necessary as kindness. The warmth of it, the shape of it, the echo of the moment, all of it asked to stay a little longer. And so it did. Its surface showed the touch of time. The hands that lifted it were often tired, not from hardship, but from honest use. There was no rush in the movement, not one that closed abruptly, but one that drifted open to the world of dreams. It eased the body from effort to rest, from thought to quiet. Nothing had to be finished. Nothing had to be solved. The cup gave permission for the day to simply be done. The body was quieter. The breath was slower. The senses had turned inward. On others, it was thin and light, almost like water touched by grain. No one minded. The point was not perfection. The point was presence. To sit with what was, rather than what should be. The flavor felt softer, rounder, more familiar. It did not ask to be noticed. It simply accompanied. No flourish, just care, just rhythm. The kind that emerges when something is done not out of habit alone, but from a quiet recognition that it matters. The ale at this hour tasted different, not because it had changed, but because the one drinking it had. This cup was not meant to energize, nor to delight. It was not a celebration. It was not a treat. It was a closing, a gentle signal that the day, with all it had brought, had reached its end. Some took the cup beside the fire, knees drawn in, eyes half closed. The volume of ale didn't matter. It was rarely a full cup, just enough to hold, just enough to warm. It was during this time that silence deepened into stillness. In many homes, the cup was shared, not always at the same table, not always at the same time. There was no rule for how long the moment should last. Some sipped slowly, taking long pauses between. Children rarely saw the full ritual. By the time the final mug was poured, they were usually asleep, curled beneath blankets still warm from hands that tucked them in. The cup before sleep became a kind of door. On some nights, the ale was stronger, aged a little longer than intended. Sometimes, after the last sip, the mug remained in hand. When the mug was finally placed down, it was done with care. Not dropped, not forgotten. Upstairs, beds waited. The linens were cool, the air still. Outside, the village had disappeared into the dark. No lights remained, no voices carried. Back in the cottage, the fire burned lower. The last coals flickered without urgency. For now, nothing more was required. And in that quiet, in that absolute softness, the world paused. Not forever, not even for long, but just enough. The cup before sleep did not carry power. It carried permission. It asked for nothing. It did not promise dreams. It did not chase away sorrow, but it made space. Space for whatever might come. In that way, it became more than a cup. It became a companion. The villagers never spoke much of this ritual. There were no stories about it, no instructions passed down. And yet, it endured. It lived not in ceremony, but in presence. The world outside the village might rush. It might clamor and spin. At the edge of the village, tucked just beyond the bend of a narrow lane, stood a house that had leaned slightly to one side for as long as anyone could remember. Its roof sagged a little, its stones were weathered, and the garden had long since given up trying to stay neat. There was one household known, not for the quantity it made nor even for the strength of its ale, but for the way it cared for the process. The brewing done here was slower, more deliberate, with a kind of patience that extended beyond the act itself. Just a few ceramic jugs, some carefully washed, some still wet with the last rinse. Shelves held bags of grain wrapped in cloth, lined up not by size or color, but by season, movements measured. There was no recipe written down, no record kept on paper. A touch to the cool side of the brewing pot. It started with water, drawn from the well behind the house, the bucket moving slowly over moss-covered stones. The well itself was shallow, fed by springs no one ever saw. The water had a softness to it, like something that had never traveled far. Windows were left slightly ajar to let it drift out, not to escape, but to share. Birds often gathered near the open shutters, perhaps drawn by the smell, or simply by the quiet rhythm within. A brief sniff of the cloth covering the fermentation jug. Not weight. They were crushed with a warm wooden pestle, in a bowl passed down through 3 generations. The sound of the grinding was soft, some chipped, some smooth, all used with care. It was rarely drunk in groups. More often, someone would take a mug outside and sit beneath the old tree near the garden, or by the low stone wall that bordered the path. The house seemed smaller then, the shadows longer, the silence thicker. The ale reflected that. It did not resist the season. It mirrored it. Every act, stirring, tasting, washing, was part of a longer breath, part of a rhythm that extended beyond a single day. There were no records of how much had been brewed, or how long each batch had taken. There were no stories written about it, and yet the villagers remembered. Not in facts, but in feeling. They would sip slowly, watching clouds, listening to the wind, or simply being still. It was not the best house. It was not the oldest, but it was the one that remembered how to wait. And in that waiting, it offered a kind of peace that did not need to be named. The soft creak of the floor, as the brewer moved across the room, knew its leaning roof, its ivy-covered walls, its slow silence. They passed it and felt their steps slow, not out of reverence, but because something in the air asked them to walk softer. And when they brewed their own ale, in kitchens far simpler, with tools less worn, they still followed that feeling, that sense of care, of time, of patience that asked for nothing in return. The way the house always smelled faintly of barley and ash, like rain against an old roof, not a task to be finished, but one to be inhabited. Other times it was dense, quiet, like earth after rain. No one praised it. No one compared it. Its only measure was whether it allowed the day to end a little more softly. Bees moved lazily past the sills. The scent of wet soil and young leaves mixed with malt in the air. The mugs felt cooler in hand, and sleep came with a different rhythm. The house held it, like a body holds breath, steady, unforced. The process could not be rushed. It responded to quiet, to temperature, to the moods of the air. Not analysis, not testing, just presence, just listening to what was needed. Some days called for brewing, others did not. There was no fixed schedule. The brew told its own time. All of it lived in the mind and the hands, passed through years of repetition, gentle observation, and long waiting. Some jars held yeast, carefully covered, sometimes sleeping for months before being stirred to life again. Now and then, not many, a neighbor with questions, a child sent with a borrowed spoon. They stepped inside and were met not with conversation, but with warmth. The kind of warmth that wrapped around the ankles like a low blanket. They did not ask for ale. They were offered a place to sit, and perhaps a cup of warm water, and that was enough. It was never spoken of as special. It simply was. Ivy crept across the walls in no particular pattern, and the wooden door groaned in protest each time it opened. A small scoop, a careful stir. Then the cloth was laid gently over the vessel, not to hide it, but to give it rest. The fermentation would begin in its own time. And yet, the house endured, as it always had. This was the house that held the brew. Though many villagers brewed their own ale, and each home had its jugs and quiet rituals. Herbs were hung to dry, but always the brewing was part of it, not separate, not elevated, just woven into the thread of everyday hours. A dented ladle, a stained linen strainer, a cracked jug sealed with wax. They looked like objects forgotten in other homes, but here they held purpose. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was hurried. Inside, the air carried a gentle scent of malt and smoke. Not strong, not clinging, just enough to suggest something always gently simmering, always gently waiting. The hearth was large, but not grand. Its stones were blackened with use, and the space around it was crowded with wooden spoons, clay pots, cloth bundles, and dried herbs tied with frayed twine. There were no great barrels, no towers of supply. The tools were humble. The person who kept the house, older than most, quieter than all, moved through the space like a whisper, steps light. Each morning began with inspection, a look into the grain jar. When the brewing began, the grains were measured by feel. Once the mash was mixed and warmed, the scent filled the cottage in slow spirals. The yeast was always added last. Days passed without change. The jug sat on the table or near the fire, depending on the weather. And while the ale transformed within the jug, life went on. Firewood was stacked. Seeds were sorted. Visitors came. The ale was not served from a tap. It was ladled gently from its jug, poured into modest mugs, each one slightly different in shape. The ale itself was never the same twice. Some days it carried a brightness, as if sunlight had touched it during brewing. In winter, the brew was darker. The grains roasted longer, the pot held closer to the fire. In spring, the ale lightened. The windows stayed open longer. What made the house special was not its ale. It was the way the house held time. Nothing here rushed. Nothing sought to be better than before. They remembered the taste of a mug shared quietly, the warmth of a cup held near the fire. Even those who never stepped inside knew the house. The house remained, season after season. The roof was patched, the door mended, but the heart of the place stayed unchanged. It held the brew. It held the silence. It held the memory of hands moving slowly, of days unfolding without urgency. Beyond the cottages and quiet lanes, past the last garden gate and the bend where the hedgerows grew tall, the land opened gently into wide, sloping fields. These were not grand stretches of farmland, nor dramatic hills. Birds moved across them in slow arcs. Trees stood in small groups, like old friends with nothing left to say. Stone walls divided space without urgency, some standing strong, others leaning inward with the weight of years. They were modest places, softly undulating, worn by centuries of footfall and wind, shaped more by time than intention. No one knew the names of those who came before, yet the land held their echo. And sometimes, when the mist settled low and the breeze passed slow and close to the skin, It felt as though the earth remembered, not in words, not in sound, but in memory. In the daylight hours, the fields were still and familiar. To walk, to remember something they had not learned but somehow knew. The fields, with their vast hush and slow breath, invited reflection, the kind that arrived not as thought, but as stillness. On many evenings, a figure could be seen seated against one of the old trees at the far end of the field, sometimes with a blanket, sometimes with a small cup. Nothing grand, nothing loud, just a presence meeting the land in quiet agreement. That long before the cottages, long before the hearths and cups, the land held gatherings. It was not for company. It was for listening. It softened the breath, stilled the hands, and allowed the weight of the world to settle without judgment. They did not say why. They did not bring others. But their presence became part of the land's rhythm. They moved in waves with the wind, brushing against worn stones and one another like voices in an ancient chorus. They would sit on the low stone walls, looking out over the uneven ground, eyes not focused on any one thing. They simply gave back whatever one brought, slowed, softened, folded in quiet. They rarely finished their drink. It wasn't about the ale. It was about being still enough to receive what the land offered. The air turned dry, and the light seemed to stretch itself thinner, longer across the land. Footprints lasted longer in the dust. The wind had a different sound, of music made from hollow bones and strings, pulled taut with patience. No one knew the truth, but the feel of it remained, not because of taste or need, but because it too had been shaped by time. And in the cottages, those who had sat beneath the open sky poured their final mugs. They drank slower, held their breath longer between sips. The taste carried echoes of grass and wind and stone, of footsteps not made that day, of stories not quite forgotten. And when they slept, their dreams were quieter, their rest was deeper, as if the land itself had followed them home, to watch that the rhythm of the earth helped shape the rhythm of the cup. On summer nights, when the air was warm and the light refused to leave, the breeze would carry something that felt like rhythm, not enough to name, just enough to notice. Sometimes wildflowers bloomed among them, not in clusters, but scattered blues, purples, pale yellows, each appearing like a soft footstep left by time. But somehow, the air changed it. Or perhaps the person drinking changed. The body relaxed differently on open ground. The silence pressed against the skin in gentler ways. The fields simply were. They lingered longer at the field's edge. Some would lay back in the grass, eyes half closed, watching the sky shift from silver to slate. Stones protruded here and there, carved by lichen more than hands. Some villagers said they were once markers. Others thought they were just the earth settling around old roots and foundations. But none disturbed them. Circles of people, long tables under trees, shared drink poured from clay jugs, not for ceremony, not for celebration, simply for being together in the open. The land seemed to breathe beneath it, warming it from below. Just the feel of it, the silence that was not empty, but full of things long past. No one built fires out there. No one brought tools. It was not a place for activity. It was a place for pausing. The grasses bent, the stones disappeared, but the shape of the land, its curves and folds, remained known. The ale in winter was darker, a quiet warmth against the cold air. Mugs were held closer, steam rising in soft columns before vanishing into the gray. But in the hours just before dawn, or just after dusk, when the air cooled and the sky softened into gray, the field seemed to whisper, often with a jug in hand and a quiet mood in their step. People said that the fields had once been louder, not with voices, but with presence. No stories had survived intact. A few sheep wandered through in spring. Children ran across them in warmer months. Their laughter carried just far enough to touch the edge of the woods. But no one built there. No one plowed deeply. The land was allowed to rest. Small mounds lay scattered across the fields, barely rising above the grasses, like forgotten sentences in a long letter. The fields were not worked often anymore. And yet, people still came. Not in crowds, not for festivals. Just one or two at a time. They came to sit. The ale brought to these fields was not for cheer. The grasses in the fields grew in thick patches, not trimmed, not controlled. In autumn, the fields became golden, not bright, but deep, like the color of aged parchment or the inside of old wood. In those moments, the ale carried the season, brewed slightly stronger, held longer in the jug. It tasted of patience and of endings. People drank more slowly. When winter came, snow sometimes blanketed the fields, but it never stayed long. It was during these cold months that the fields spoke most clearly, though still without sound. The elders in the village, those whose steps had grown slow and whose hands bore the likeness of time, often visited the fields near dusk. Some carried small flasks tucked inside woolen coats. The fields were not magical. They did not promise dreams or visions. A cup of ale taken there had a different quality. It was the same brew, same mug. There were stories, soft, half-remembered things of people who had once danced there. Even now, when most had grown used to sleeping early and staying indoors, the fields kept their openness, their presence, their slow offering. It was said, quietly and without insistence, that the land helped the ale to settle, that those who brewed nearby found it easier to wait. The village never made plans for the fields. No fences were added, no signs were placed. Children were not told to avoid them, nor were they encouraged to go. And the ale, the ever-present companion of slow hours, seemed to belong there more than anywhere else. When the stars returned and the fields disappeared into shadow, only the faint shape of the land remained, curves against deeper dark, silence becoming whole. Beneath one of the older cottages in the village, where the floor creaked more gently and the fire never quite went out, there was a cellar. It was not hidden, nor was it often mentioned. It existed like a low breath, like the pause between words. In an old story, the stairs to the cellar were worn smooth. Each step bowed slightly at the center, shaped by feet that had passed over them for generations. The wooden rail had long since stopped being straight. It curved with the rhythm of the wall beside it, following the house's slow lean into age. At the bottom of the stairs, the barrel room began. It was not large. It did not echo. The ceiling was low, and the walls were made of stone that seemed more earth than structure. Moss grew in the corners. The air was always cool, always damp, not unpleasantly so, just enough to soften the sound of footsteps and keep the space hushed. The barrels rested there in neat rows, not lined by perfect angles, but by quiet balance, each one different, in size, some small enough to carry, others wide enough to sit upon. They were made of oak or chestnut or wood so old its source had been forgotten. Iron hoops held them together, darkened by time and touch. They did not move. They did not need. 2. The room held a stillness that went deeper than silence. It was the kind of stillness found in places that had never tried to change. It had no sharp edges. It offered no surprises. It simply held what had been placed there, as it had done for decades, perhaps centuries. Sometimes a lantern was lit. Its light glowed dimly against the walls, flickering across dust motes suspended in air like tiny echoes. The barrels did not glisten. They absorbed light slowly, as though unwilling to disturb the calm. The sound of the barrel room was not a sound in the usual sense. It was more a presence. The soft creak of wood adjusting to pressure. The subtle drip from a distant corner where condensation gathered. The faintest sigh of air as it moved between narrow spaces. Visitors rarely came here. Only the brewer. And even then, not every day. The room did not require tending. It required patience. Each barrel held ale in a different stage, some resting, some fermenting, some nearly ready. None in a hurry. The ale changed slowly. The waystone softens under running water, without notice. Without urgency. There were marks on each barrel. Not labels, not dates. Just small carvings, shapes etched lightly into the staves. A leaf, a line, a crescent. Moon, these were the brewer's language. Not to instruct, but to remember. Not to control, but to feel. The scent in the room was deep, not strong, not sweet, just rich, like soil after rain, like bark warmed by the sun. It layered itself in the air, settling into clothes and hair and thought. Even after one had left the room. In the coldest months, the room barely changed. The ale rested more deeply then, slowed by the chill. The wood of the barrels tightened. The air grew heavier. Even the quiet seemed to deepen, wrapping itself around every surface like a thick blanket. In warmer seasons, small shifts occurred. The barrels breathed more easily. The scent grew sharper, more alive. The sounds, too, became more distinct. The stretch of a wooden plank, the soft tick of a bubble rising through the ale. No one rushed the contents of the room. No schedule dictated when a barrel should be opened. It was the ale that decided, and the room, in turn, made space for that decision. Sometimes, after drawing a small sample, the brewer would sit on the low stool by the wall. The mug held loosely, the ale barely tasted. It was not a test. It was not evaluation. It was a moment. A quiet acknowledgement of change, of time, of stillness becoming flavor. The mug would be returned, the stool pushed back, the light extinguished, and the room, undisturbed, would return to its waiting. On nights when the wind blew strong outside, the sound barely reached the barrel room. The stone held the quiet too well. Only the lowest rumble could be heard, distant, soft, as if nature herself were speaking in sleep. There were stories, of course, passed in low tones over cups, always with a half smile. Stories that said the barrels remembered, that each sip carried not just grain and yeast, but memory, of the seasons they had lived through, of the hands that shaped them, of the silences they had held. Whether it was true or not, the feeling remained, that in every draught drawn from a barrel there was more than ale. There was time. Sometimes, when a barrel was emptied, it was not removed. It remained for a while longer, its inside wiped clean, but its wood still fragrant, still echoing with what it once held. The brewer might sit beside it, not to mourn, not to plan, just to rest. Eventually, a new barrel would take its place, brought down the stairs slowly, with care, its surface catching the lantern light for the first time. It would be set gently, its newness a quiet promise. And then, over days and weeks and months, it too would change, becoming part of the room's rhythm. The sound of the barrel room was a rhythm, after all. Not a beat, not a melody, but a slow, unfolding pattern. Like breath over hours, like seasons over years. Even those who never saw the room felt its presence in the ale they drank. They said the first sip was always different, rounder, deeper, more still, as though the silence of the cellar lingered in the mug just for a moment. The room beneath the house never asked for notice. It did not announce its importance, but it remained low, quiet, patient, shaping the ale, shaping the hands that brewed it, shaping the stillness that filled each night's final cup. And above it, in the cottage, the fire flickered gently. The floor above creaked sometimes with footsteps, but below the barrels rested, always waiting, always holding, always listening. It began as a whisper, as it always did, not sudden, not sharp, just a faint tapping, like fingers brushing lightly against old wood. The first drops of rain touched the roof in scattered patterns, barely noticeable at first, blending into the hush of evening in the village. The sky had been gray all day. Not heavy or dark, but softly overcast, like wool pulled thin across the sky. The clouds moved slowly. No wind stirred the leaves. It was a day that seemed unsure of its own direction, as though it too had decided to rest. And when the rain finally came, it brought no drama, just stillness. The kind that entered every corner of the house, not with weight, but with calm. Inside one of the older cottages, the fire burned low. Its light danced gently on the walls, reflected in the smooth surfaces of mugs, tools, and the polished grain of wooden furniture. A kettle murmured near the edge of the hearth, and the room smelled faintly of warm bread and earth not above. The roof accepted the rain dot. It was a patchwork roof, made of old tiles. Some slipped slightly out of place, others moss-covered and smooth. In a few spots, small buckets or copper pans had been placed to catch persistent leaks. But no one minded. The sound of droplets falling into metal was just another note in the evening's slow music. The rain was soft at first, then steadier. A rhythm emerged, not constant, but layered. Some drops fell heavily against the windowsill. Others threaded through the chimney. Still others pattered lightly on the outer walls. It was a sound that seemed to come from every direction at once, and none at all. For those inside, there was no reason to go out. The rain was not to be escaped. It was to be heard, to be lived alongside, to be welcomed like an old companion. The ale, when sipped on such a night, tasted fuller. The warmth of it met the cool air in the throat. It lingered a little longer in the mouth, the way stories linger in the mind after the fire has gone out. It soothed the fingers, the chest, the breath. On shelves, mugs waited to be filled, some larger, for slower evenings, others smaller, for quiet company. Their glaze caught the firelight as the rain kept falling. The sound of the rain did something to time. It stretched it, softened it, made each moment feel more complete. There was no rush to finish anything. A spoon could rest half-polished on the table. A coat could remain unbuttoned on the peg. The rain would be there, constant, gentle, marking the hours better than any clock dot in the attic rooms. Beneath the slanted ceiling, the rain sounded louder. The tiles above were thinner there, closer to the ear. People lay beneath woolen blankets, listening without needing to listen. The sound held them in a kind of cradle, a reminder that the world outside could be soft too. Some of the village children called it ale weather, not because the drink changed, but because their parents always poured one more mug on nights like this. Something about the sound of the rain called for staying awake just a little longer, not to do anything, but to be, to sit, to breathe, to feel the world fall quiet together. In one house, near the end of the lane, a candle burned in a windowsill. Its flame flickered gently as the rain traced winding paths down the glass. No one sat nearby, but the light remained, not as a signal, but as a presence. It was there to greet the rain, to glow for those passing by, even if none did. Uphill, in a house that leaned eastward with the slope, the roof had begun to sing in places. Not a tune, but a set of tones. Low, muffled thumps where drops fell onto thicker boards. High, tapping notes where the gutters held onto water before letting go. People inside the house had grown used to it. They said it helped them sleep. They didn't need music on nights like this. The roof played its own. Out in the fields, the grass bowed under the rain's touch, not in defeat, but in welcome. The earth opened slightly, letting the moisture in. The trees dripped slowly, their branches brushing against one another with damp fingers. No footsteps passed that way. No wheels turned down the road. Even the animals tucked into stillness, wrapped in their own warmth. Back in the cottages, the rain became a backdrop to everything. To the clink of mugs, to the soft breath of someone dozing in a chair, to the gentle rustle of a blanket being pulled tighter. It entered the rhythm of the night, not interrupting, but deepening it. Some people sat by the hearth with a mug in both hands. They did not drink quickly. They sipped, paused, watched the flames, listened. Others stood near the window, their foreheads resting lightly against the cool pane, watching nothing in particular. Just watching the ale tasted different in the rain. Not sweeter, not stronger, but rounder, more whole. Perhaps because the drink mirrored the moment, a quiet presence, a low hum, something old and steady that asked for nothing. Time passed. Without notice, one candle burned low. Another was lit. The rain slowed, then resumed, and softened again. No one marked the changes. They simply happened, as natural as breath. Even the barrels in the cellar seemed to respond. Their wood tightened slightly in the damp, holding the ale closer, cradling it like a keeper of secrets. The cool air moved between them in silent currents, and above, the sound of rain played on. Unhurried in some cottages, small puddles formed where the roof had surrendered a little. Towels were placed, mugs were moved, no one grumbled. Rain was not a bother. It was a companion, a gentle visitor reminding the village of rhythm, of slowness, of pause. Eventually, some turned in for the night. Lamps were lowered. Fires were left to fade, but the rain stayed. It tapped lightly against shuttered windows. It echoed gently in empty pots outside. It whispered across rooftops, over fences, down the long eaves of barns and sheds. For those still awake, the final sips of ale tasted of warmth and wood, of soil and stone, of patience. And as eyelids grew heavy and breaths deepened, the rain did not insist. It did not call. It merely continued, soft, present, holding the world in its slow embrace. In this way, the village slept, one mug at a time, one drop at a time. One quiet hour folded into another, all beneath the steady music of the roof. In most cottages of the village, lights were dimmed not long after supper. Mugs were emptied. The last embers in the hearth were coaxed into gentle rest, and feet shuffled toward soft beds warmed by wool and habit. Sleep came naturally to those who followed the rhythm of day and dusk, light and shadow. But not everyone settled early. There were always a few who stayed up late, not with purpose, not out of necessity, but simply because the quiet called them. The world after sundown felt different, the stillness more complete, the hours more spacious. In those hours, thoughts moved slowly, without expectation, and in their hands, often as not, there was a small mug of ale, half filled, the warmth rising faintly into the air. They did not gather. Each stayed in their own space. In a corner by the fire, at a window seat looking toward darkened fields, or in a small chair that creaked with memory. The house had its own voice at that hour. Floorboards shifted gently. The kettle sighed on. The hearth. Outside, the breeze touched the shutters and moved on. These were not restless people. They were not seeking distraction or escape. They simply belonged to the night as much as to the day. Their minds wandered in wider loops. They saw no need to push sleep when wakefulness had turned kind and quiet. Some would tend to small tasks, mending a sock, stirring the coals, writing in a journal whose pages curled at the corners. But most often they just sat, not because they had nothing to do, but because sitting became the doing. Breathing was enough. Listening to the house breathe back was enough. The ale at this hour changed. It felt deeper, not heavier, but slower somehow, as if it knew these sips were not for celebration or even rest, but for keeping company with the hush of the world. The taste lingered a little longer. The warmth moved not just through the chest, but into the limbs, the fingertips, the quiet spaces behind the eyes. Some stared at the fire, letting its low light shape thoughts that had no need to become words. Others watched the night beyond the windows, seeing only the soft outlines of trees and the pale shimmer of sky. In this dimness, things lost their names and became only shapes. Gentle and familiar dot in one cottage, a clock ticked softly, not to measure time, but to keep it company. In another, a cat curled near the warmth of the stove, tail flicking slowly as if it too dreamed with eyes half open. There was no schedule here. Midnight might come and go unnoticed, or it might be marked by the soft lifting of a mug, a final swallow, a quiet breath. These hours did not demand anything. They gave space instead. Space to remember, to wonder, to do nothing at all. The ones who stayed up late often found that their thoughts took on a different shape. Ideas did not rush in. They arrived gently, like the tide sliding into a shallow bay. Memories rose, not in sharp detail, but in softened outlines. A face, a scent, the feel of walking beside someone long ago. These things visited without pain, without urgency. They were simply there. Sometimes a tune would come, hummed without sound, just a rhythm felt in the chest or traced by tapping fingers on a wooden armrest. The late hours welcomed such things. They did not question or interrupt. The houses themselves seemed to understand. Their walls held the warmth a little longer. The windows offered just enough reflection to make the dark outside feel less distant. The rafters held their creaks until the wind had passed. The ones who stayed up late did. Not fear sleep. They welcomed it when it arrived, but they did not chase it. They did not measure the hours lost or gained. They trusted the slow turning of time. They drank their ale and let their thoughts drift until sleep gathered at the edge, then wrapped. Around them without effort in the quiet village, only a few lights stayed on after the others had gone out. A single window glowing faintly behind ivy. A warm square of light beneath a roofline. Those were the signs. Not of loneliness, but of presence. Of someone keeping watch not over others, but over the moment. It was said that dreams bore after. Midnight carried a different weight, that they lingered longer, that they grew from thoughts not spoken aloud. And while no one studied such things, those who stayed up late often woke with dreams that felt like mist, hard to hold, but impossible to forget. The ale itself seemed to understand its role. It was never overpoured, never forgotten. The mugs used in these hours were often older, thicker around the rim, glazed in darker tones. They felt right in the hand, solid and patient. The liquid inside needed no stirring. It needed no garnish, just presence, just time. Occasionally, someone might rise and step outside for a moment, the night air cool on the skin, the scent of damp earth or wood smoke moving past. They might stand in the doorway, arms crossed gently, eyes tracing the horizon for no reason but peace. Then, slowly, they would return inside, close the door with care, and settle once again into the soft rhythm of the hour in these moments. Even the air inside the cottage seemed to change. It felt thicker, not with heat, but with memory. With the residue of lived days and spoken thoughts and unspoken ones too. No one taught them to do this. No one told them that these late hours held meaning. They simply felt it, knew it in the same way one knows when to speak and when to stay quiet, when to pour another mug, when to let the warmth fade slowly into the hands. These hours held space for everything, for old grief softened by time, for small joys remembered without reason, for the gentle ache of love still present, even in silence. The ones who stayed up late did not need to explain. And when, at last, their lids grew heavy and the mug was empty, they moved to bed without ritual, the sheets already warmed, the air already still. They slipped beneath the covers, carrying the quiet with them. And the houses, those silent companions, accepted the shift. The fire dimmed without protest. The windows closed their reflections. The floor did not creak again until morning. The village slept, all of it now, but the night had been shared, even if only by a few. And the ale, with its slow warmth and deeper notes, had done what it always did. It had kept company with time. There were no books that told the full history of the village. No one had written down the tales in neat chapters or drawn timelines across parchment. There were records, yes, and stories passed on, but much of what was known lived in the objects. That had outlasted those who once used them. Some histories were carved, others were stitched, but many, perhaps more than most realized, were left behind in rings. Not of stone, not of gold, but of moisture. The small circular marks left behind by mugs of ale resting on wood in nearly every cottage. There was a table or a shelf or a stool with faint circles etched into its surface. They were not etched by tool or design. They were left by time, by habit, by countless evenings where someone had set down a warm mug and let it be. Over the years, the circles deepened. They stained slightly, soaked into the grain of the wood, spread outward and faded, then returned again. Not all were visible at once. Some only appeared when the light caught them sideways, like a secret whispered to the eye. No one minded them. No one polished them away. To remove the marks would be to erase something that mattered, something wordless and rooted in presence. In the old tavern, long since closed, but still standing near the crossroads, there was a table kept beneath. A cloth, not hidden, only softened. The cloth was sometimes removed when the season turned, or when someone wished to sit beside it in silence. That table held more rings than could be counted. Some overlapped, some stretched into ovals, as if mugs had been set down hastily in conversation, or mid-laughter. Others were perfectly round, symmetrical, placed with care. The wood had darkened over time, but the circles remained, some pale, some dark, some barely there. They were like footprints in a quiet forest, evidence of paths walked, of pauses taken, of stories shared without needing to be told. Elders said you could trace a memory with your fingertip if you followed a ring slowly enough. It would do it sometimes, gently, without words, running one finger in a slow spiral, eyes distant, breath even, not to recall something specific, but to feel time resting in place. Another. Cottages, tables bore fewer rings, but the meaning remained. A single mark could carry the weight of many evenings. A faint circle near the edge of a bench, a spot worn into a windowsill where someone once rested their mug while watching rainfall. Even children noticed. They would place their own cups, deliberately in line with the old rings, watching the condensation form and mimic what had come before. No one told them to. They simply understood that the rings were part of the story. The ale, in its warmth, always left its trace, especially in the cool of spring or the damp hush of autumn. A freshly poured mug, set on old wood, would give a soft hiss of contact, and as it rested, a ring would appear, delicate, ephemeral, slowly forming before settling into the surface. Some tried using coasters, bits of cloth or leather squares to prevent the marks. But over time, even those grew soft at the edges, worn by repetition, their purpose yielding to the rhythm of the room. The history left by rings was not always gentle. There were tables where a sharp scrape had interrupted a circle, where a ring stopped suddenly, as if lifted too soon. These, too, had their place. Not every memory was smooth, but all were part of the whole. In one cottage, there was a long table where generations had sat. Its surface was uneven now, bowed in the middle, patched in one corner, but still solid. The rings there told of harvest seasons, of winter nights, of quiet breakfasts and long silences. No two were the same, and none were forgotten. When visitors came, they sometimes remarked on the patterns. They saw them as decoration or as signs of age. But to those who lived among them, they were something more, a language of presence, of small choices made over years. The rings were never planned. They arrived without ceremony, just as the ale was poured without flourish. But together, they marked the passage of life in its slowest, most honest form. In the brewing shed, a large wooden counter bore its own constellation of rings. The brewer never wiped them away. He worked around them, over them, letting them shape his movements. Each ring reminded him of a batch tasted, a visitor welcomed, a season marked by scent and sip. He sometimes traced them with a cloth not to clean, but to feel the years. The wood beneath his hands remembered what the mind might forget. The rings spoke of patience, of waiting, of time given freely. Outside, in the covered seating near the garden, benches bore rings too, faint from sun and wind, but present, especially beneath the spot where the plum tree cast its earliest shade. The rings there were often newer, thinner, less settled, but they belonged just the same. Some evenings, as the sun sank and the day folded inward, people would sit and let their mugs rest without lifting them too often. They watched the rings form, not in haste, but in harmony with the air, the wood, the quiet. They knew the marks would fade eventually, blend into the grain, shift with the light. But the act of leaving them mattered more than their permanence. Even in the lofts, where no tables stood, small stools and window ledges bore signs of use. A single pale ring beside a woolen cushion, a faint circle near a lamp base. Each one spoke of a moment that needed nothing more than being allowed. The ale, always humble, never asked for acknowledgement. But it stayed long enough to leave a mark. It moved through homes like a soft echo, and where it paused, it left its shape behind. Some said you could map the history of the village by collecting the ringed surfaces. Line them up by age, by tone, by depth. You could see the decades in wood alone, the way people had sat, paused, breathed, the way they had held space for one another without words. There was no need to preserve the tables in museums or under glass. They lived best where they had always been, in kitchens, in sheds, by fireplaces. They asked only to be used, to be touched, to be given the chance to receive another cup. The ones who remembered often smiled when they saw new rings appear, not because they wished to keep the marks pristine, but because they knew what they meant. A mug left long enough to settle, a drink shared without hurry, a moment allowed to belong. And so the history continued, quietly, one circle at a time, not drawn with ink, but with presence, with ale, with warmth. In the stillness of each home, the rings held their place, neither loud nor shy, simply part of the rhythm, part of the slow, careful music that shaped the village, not through grand tales, but through the soft weight of mugs and the gentle trust of hands setting them down. Before the cobbled streets were laid, before the fences leaned with age, and the paths grew soft beneath so many boots, the ale had already begun. It did not arrive with noise. There was no grand feast, no sudden invention. It came as things so often did in the village, quietly, steadily, like mist slipping into the valleys at dusk. The first brews were simple, more patience than precision. Grains crushed by hand, water drawn from a stream still unclaimed by name, and fires lit with care, but without measure. The elders spoke of these early ales not as something better or stronger, but as something slower, brewed not from knowledge, but from listening. The ingredients were not weighed, but felt. The timing was not watched, but sensed. A shadow across the doorway, a shift in the birdsong, the way the evening air held its breath. These were the signs. The ale of the elder days was never rushed. It was made beside hearths that smoked without complaint, stirred in wooden barrels, bound with string before metal was common. Nothing was sterile. Everything was alive. The brewer's hands carried the warmth of labor, and the smell of mash clung to the folds of sleeves long after the fire had faded. People came to know the seasons by the taste of the ale. Spring brought a brightness, as if the drink itself remembered. Sunlight through wet branches. Autumn's brew was earthier, richer, with a stillness that mirrored the shortening days. Winter ales were deep and soft, like fur-lined cloaks and old stories. Summer, light and fleeting, passed over the tongue like laughter across an open field dot. It wasn't sold, not in those days. It was shared, passed in cups of wood or clay, sometimes with cracks mended in wax or string. One person would sip, then hand it over with a nod. There was no need to speak. The ale carried the words. The cottages were smaller then, roofs thatched more loosely, windows little more than holes with oiled cloth. Yet even in the earliest hours of evening, there was warmth, mugs set near the hearthstone, not to be forgotten, but to wait their turn. Evenings passed not in talk, but in shared silences, where the ale warmed not just the hands, but the space between those gathered. The village itself changed around the ale, not because of it, but in rhythm with it. People gathered more often. Near the old stone, where the fires burned low and the barrels were rolled out from sheds that leaned with time. They sat on logs or the ground itself, and the sharing of drink became a kind of gentle ritual, one that asked for no oaths, only presence. In the elder days, the ale was not just drink. It was time slowed into liquid. The hours folded themselves into each barrel, and those who drank it often said they felt themselves pause. Not lost, not frozen, just ... present. There were no written recipes, only memory. One brewer taught another by standing beside them, by placing their hand over theirs. As they stirred, the grain was judged by feel, the yeast by scent, the water by how it tasted after sitting overnight in a clay bowl. It was an art shaped more by touch than by instruction. Ales varied wildly, too. One cottage might produce something deep and nutty, thick on the tongue. Another, light and fizzy, with a hint of apple or smoke. No one corrected another. The drink was not meant to be perfected. It was meant to be real. And each batch told a story. There was a brew remembered from a long drought, thin, with barely enough barley, but still carried across fields in jugs wrapped in damp cloth to keep it cool. People sipped it slowly, grateful not for its taste, but for its arrival. Another year, after a bountiful harvest, the ale was rich and golden, poured into carved cups that had waited all year for something special. It tasted of abundance, but also of rest, of fields that could breathe again. Even the vessels mattered. The earliest mugs were often repurposed from other things, ladles, bowls, carved gourds. Each held more than ale. They held hands worn by work and mouths softened by age, and the invisible thread of memory passed from one person to another. There were times, too, when the ale was made not for drinking, but for honoring, set out in the fields at the edge of winter, or poured slowly into the earth at the roots of an old tree, not in sorrow, not in superstition, but in thanks, for growth, for time, for return. And there were seasons when the brew was thicker, clouded, with grain or herbs gathered from the forest edges. These ales were sipped in smaller amounts, often in silence, as if their purpose was not refreshment, but dreaming. People said such drinks brought long, curling sleep and dreams as old as stone. It was never a luxury. Ale was not rare, nor expensive. It was simply part of life, as familiar as rain, as dependable as the turning of leaves. It was there when children were born, when songs were first hummed, when fences were mended, and hands grew tired. It was not the focus. It was the warmth beside the work dot. As tools changed, so did the brewing. Clay jugs became barrels. Fire pits became stoves. Yet something remained, the slow patience, the respect for the unknown, the understanding that ale could not be forced, only invited. Even now, some cottages still held mugs older than memory, their handles worn smooth, their lips uneven. They had held hundreds of sips, each one linked to a face long faded, a hand long stilled. And yet, when raised to the mouth, they tasted of continuity. The ale of the elder days was not better because it was old. It was better because it was slow, because it was not made to impress, but to include, to remind each person who drank that they were part of something unmeasured, unspoken, unfolding dot. And though the barrels now stood taller, and the tools hung on iron hooks, and the measuring was done by spoon instead of sight, the spirit remained. It lingered in the silence between sips, in the way people still paused after pouring, in the quiet understanding that some parts of life need no improvement, only attention. Even the land remembered. The field still grew barley with a rhythm, shaped by hands that had vanished generations ago. The stream, narrower now, still whispered past stones, once cupped with water for boiling. The wind, when it shifted just right, carried the scent of brewing over the rooftops like a story too soft to speak. And so the ale remained, not just in bottles or cellars, but in time itself, in the slow afternoons, in the warm evenings, in the hush of the firelight as mugs rest on wooden tables, leaving faint rings that only appear when the light catches just so. There was a time each year when the village softened even further, not in silence, but in slowness. In the way footsteps paused longer before doorways, in how tools were put away earlier in the day, in the quiet expectancy that filled the air. Like the scent of warm earth after rain dot, it was called a festival, though it bore little resemblance to parades or banners or the sound of drums. There were no stages, no speeches, no precise start or end. Instead, it unfolded like the changing of a season, gradually, gently, with each person stepping into it at their own pace. The festival of still ale, some called it. Others, simply, the slow day's dot. It began when the last of the late summer grain was gathered, when the air took on that soft edge that hinted at cooler nights, when the leaves had not yet turned, but shadows stretched a little farther across the grass. In those days, the brewers brought out their gentlest barrels. Ale brewed not for strength, but for warmth dot. The first mugs were poured in quiet, set on tables with care. Nothing was announced. There were no bells. Only the soft clink of pottery, the low hum of voices drifting in and out of silence, the familiar scent of hops in bread, and smoke curling in the air. People dressed no differently. They wore what they always wore, linen faded by sun, wool softened by years of wash. What changed was the rhythm, the pace of breath, the loosened hold on time. Cottages that normally tucked in after supper stayed lit a little longer, not out of excitement but contentment. Doors remained open. Lamps flickered low and steady. Children wandered between chairs. Elders sat with hands folded, content just to feel the wood beneath their palms and the air against their cheeks. The ale was never poured quickly. It was ladled, held a moment, then given. Each mug warm to the touch, smooth from use, carried slowly from one hand to another. The festival was not meant to entertain. It was meant to slow the world, to stretch each moment just a little longer, like dough left to rise in a warm kitchen. And so, each task took its time. Bread was kneaded slowly. Vegetables were chopped in long, easy motions. Stories were told with long pauses between sentences. Outside, tables were moved beneath trees or beside stone walls, still holding the heat of the day. People sat on blankets or low stools. Some lay back and looked at the sky, not to find anything in it, but to feel it overhead. There was music, though not always. Sometimes just the soft sound of a flute. Sometimes a voice, low and steady, singing not for applause, but for the way sound felt moving through the night air. At other times, silence reigned, the good kind, full of presence. And always, always, there was the ale, not in abundance, but in welcome. Its warmth matched the mood of the day, gentle, full, with a quiet finish. It did not call attention to itself. It invited pause. The barrels, too, had waited for this moment, resting for months in cool corners, their wood breathing slowly. When opened, they released not just scent, but memory, the kind of memory that lives in scent and taste more than thought. Some villagers took just a sip, and that was enough. Others kept their mugs nearby, letting them cool, refilling only when it felt right. The mugs, each one familiar, carried the season with them. In their glaze, in their weight, in the faint lines that marked years of use. There were no games, no prizes, no competitions. The children played as they always did, barefoot in the grass, voices rising and falling like birdsong. The adults talked or didn't. They sat, they leaned. They watched the sky shift color as the sun moved lower than before. As the first evening settled, the fires were lit with care, not high, not bright, just enough to warm a circle of stones, to flicker across tired feet and calm faces. Bread was passed around, torn by hand. Cheese shared in quiet. No rush to reach the end of anything. Each day of the festival was like this. Each hour more a feeling than a schedule. Some villagers took the time to visit old places. A favorite tree, a fence built long ago, the path by the mill where moss grew thick between the stones. They walked slowly, not to arrive, but to remember what it felt like to be still. The brewers moved gently between barrels, checking nothing, adjusting. Nothing, only watching. They sipped now and then, not in judgment, but in appreciation. Each batch had taken its time. Each was exactly what it needed to be. On the third night, a long table was set beneath the elder tree. No one had asked for it. It simply happened. Boards brought from sheds, legs repaired. A cloth laid gently across its length. Candles placed with space between them. The meal was made without a list, brought in baskets and bowls, served without claim. That night, the ale was darker, slightly spiced. It held the depth of the soil, the quiet of cellars, the memory of hands long gone. Each sip grounded this body, not heavy, not dull, but present. People lingered long after the food was done, some with heads rested on arms, some with eyes closed. The tree above them moved slightly in the breeze, and the night stretched long and wide. Even after the festival days passed, the slowness lingered. The mugs returned to shelves, the barrels sealed again, but the rhythm remained. For a while, work began a little later. Doors stayed open longer. Sleep came more gently. And in the corners of tables, fresh wings appeared. Faint circles that caught. The light at the right angle. New marks in the long story of mugs and evenings and breath taken slowly. The festival never ended loudly. It faded, like mist with the sun. And no one ever knew the exact moment it was over. But those who had sat beneath trees, who had held warm mugs and let their shoulders drop, carried it with them, not as memory, but as mood. A softness in the spine, a rhythm in the chest, a reminder that not everything needed to be done quickly, that some of life's sweetest moments arrived when nothing was demanded of them. And so each year, without plan or invitation, it returned. When the air turned a certain way, when the fields grew still, when the ale tasted not of celebration, but of home. The season was changing, though it did so without drama or haste. It began with a longer pause before the light reached the windows in the morning. The sun rose at an angle that left the fences in shadow longer than usual. The birds were quieter. The grass no longer carried the same shimmer. Even the wind, once warm and filled with the scent of soil and leaves, had taken on a crispness that hinted at the days ahead. There was no urgency, only the steady arrival of something older, something known. In the village, this time of year was known for its hush. The festivals had passed. The harvests had been gathered and stored. The tools had been cleaned and stacked in sheds, where cobwebs quietly returned. The ground was firm, but no longer warm. Boots left shallow prints, and the air felt thinner. This was the time when movement slowed, and the inside of cottages became smaller worlds unto themselves. It was a season not of beginnings, but of retreat. Brewers called it the last pour, the final batch of ale made before the barrels were sealed for winter. These were not the rich ales of the harvest or the playful brews of spring. They were something quieter. Made in smaller batches, often by a single person at a time, they carried a kind of inwardness. The color was darker, the foam softer, and the scent held something thoughtful, not sad, not heavy, just still, as though the ale itself knew it was time to rest. Each cottage treated the last pour with quiet respect. Some brewed just enough to fill 2 mugs. Others shared their last ale with neighbors, offering small jugs wrapped in cloth. There were no toasts, no gathering calls, only a mutual understanding that this was the last of it for now. After this, the ale would be gone until the world began to warm again. But no one seemed to mourn it. They simply sipped a little slower and set their mugs down with more care. The mugs themselves seemed heavier now. Perhaps it was the way the hands that held them had grown tired with the long year behind them. Or maybe it was the weight of time, layered into the clay by years of evenings just like this. Either way, the mugs were lifted more deliberately, and when set down, they left soft rings on tables that were already marked by generations of such pauses. The tables, too, seemed to understand that this was nearly the end of the cycle. Inside, the cottages were darker earlier in the evening. Lamps were lit not for brightness, but for comfort. Their glow was soft and low, casting long shadows across floorboards and ceiling beams. The fires were built small and close, just enough heat to keep the air moving. People wrapped themselves in wool or linen. Some added extra cushions to their favorite chairs. Everything was geared toward staying, not going, toward holding still, rather than seeking out. Meals were simpler now, but heavier. Stews bubbled slowly on the hearth. Bread was baked thick and sliced wide. Herbs dried earlier in the year now hung in bundles from ceiling hooks, their fragrance faint but steady. Nothing in the cottage was rushed. Even the sound of a spoon stirring soup was slower. In one corner, a basket held a blanket that had not been used since last year's snow. It would come out soon. Everyone knew that, though no one mentioned. And through it all, the ale remained, quiet, present, uninsistent. It did not call for attention, but it received it. Sipped slowly beside a fire. Rested on a windowsill to cool slightly. Poured not to quench thirst, but to accompany stillness. Some villagers drank it while staring out into the dark yard, where the last leaves clung to low branches. Others drank it while sitting at the foot of their beds, not quite ready to lie down, not quite ready to speak. Some of the older villagers believed the last pour had a dream-like quality, that it helped bring longer sleep or softer thoughts, not because of anything within the ale itself, but because of the rhythm it carried. It had taken months to brew. It had waited in the dark. It had been shaped by the warmth of summer and the patience of autumn. And now, in the early quiet of the turning season, it was here. Briefly, just enough to be noticed, the animals knew. The shift, too. Dogs began to curl tighter in their sleeping spots. Cats found higher shelves near the chimney, where the heat rose. Even the chickens moved slower, staying closer together under their thatched roof. The whole village took on a kind of collective breath, long and slow, as though the land itself were preparing to close its eyes. And in every cottage, in a cup or a jug, or a small wooden bowl, the last pour waited to be held by the end of the week. Most of the mugs had been washed and stored, not because the ale had run out, but because the need for it had passed. The ritual had been fulfilled. The final warmth had been shared. The last sips had been taken not with ceremony, but with care. A few mugs were left on shelves by the fire, their interiors holding the scent of what once was, not cleaned too thoroughly, just left for a while. As a kind of echo dot in one cottage, a half-mug of ale remained on the table until morning. Not forgotten, just unhurried. The person who had poured it had fallen asleep in their chair, a shawl wrapped loosely around their shoulders. The fire had gone low. Outside, frost had begun to touch the corners of the window pane. Inside, nothing moved. Not the mug, not the air. Just the slow drift of sleep settling over everything like snow that had not yet begun to fall. Soon, the barrels would be sealed completely. The cellar doors fastened tight. The brewing stones left untouched. The kettles and ladles stacked carefully and covered in cloth. There would be no more bubbling, no scent of grain, no warm mist rising in the shed. The ale would sleep through the winter, and the village would do the same, waking only to the smallest things, the crackle of fire, the creak of old floorboards, the slow, steady passage of snow past the windows. The last pour was never about quantity. It was about rhythm. It reminded everyone that the world had turned. Once more, that warmth had come and gone. That light had filled the fields, then faded. And now it was time to sit down, to hold still, to let the cold arrive without resistance, to let the hands rest, the thoughts slow, the breath lengthen. The ale had done its part. Now it too would sleep, and so the mugs were turned upside down, the cloths folded, the tables wiped clean, the last drops gone, or nearly, the rooms quiet again, not empty, only full in a different way, full of memory, full of rest. There are stories that end with events, with decisions or discoveries, with things changing sharply as if marked in bold. But this story, like the ale that flowed quietly through its heart, does not end so much as it fades, slowly, gently. Like firelight lowering itself into ash. The village remains. Time does what it always does, softens edges, smooths the footprints, quiets the corners. But the memory lingers. It drifts through the rafters of old cottages. It rests beneath moss-covered stones. It floats on the surface of half-forgotten mugs, tucked in cupboards that no longer open often. And it lives in the quiet, steady echo of people who once gathered without rush, without spectacle, without need for anything more than company and warmth. The ale was never about drink alone. It was about presence. It was the gentle pause between hours, the shared silence between. Friends, the weight of a wooden mug in hand, while the fire murmured something that no one needed to answer. And as the seasons passed, and faces came and went, that quiet practice of stillness endured. People didn't always notice it happening. They simply lived it, in every careful brew, in every unhurried sip, in every moment they allowed the world to move around them while they remained still, even long after the village began to change, as fences were rebuilt, as stone paths were laid straighter, As glass replaced oiled cloth in the windows, there were those who remembered. Not in words, but in rhythm. They remembered not what was said, but how it felt to sit beneath a tree while someone poured you a drink, to listen to the wind and let it do all the talking, to measure a day not in tasks completed, but in how slowly you moved through it. And so, each year, in some small way, the ale returned. Sometimes in a gathering, sometimes in solitude, sometimes in a mug, sometimes in a memory. A slow moment beside a fire, a quiet breath at the end of a long day, a sudden thought of barley and smoke, of cool cellars and warm light. It didn't need to be explained. It was just there, like a familiar scent on an old coat, like a song. You remember without knowing when you learned it. In that village, or any village like it, there was always one last barrel that hadn't yet been emptied, tucked in a corner, half forgotten, waiting for the right evening, the right quiet, the right hush in the air that said, yes, now would be a good time to remember the stillness, to pour something without hurry, to sit without purpose, to listen to the way time stretches when you do nothing at all. Maybe you have felt something like it. A slow evening when the light was just right. A cup in your hands. A blanket over your knees. A silence that felt not empty, but full. Full of old stories. Full of rest. Full of everything you didn't need to say aloud. That is where this story ends. Not with a moment, but with a mood. With the shape of a breath you forgot you were holding. With the warmth of a mug slowly cooling in your palms. The people who drank that ale, who brewed it and shared it and carried it through the seasons. They're no longer here, but the feeling they left behind remains. It's in the way we still lean toward firelight. In the way we pause just a second longer at the edge of a field. In the way we touch a mug with both hands, as though remembering how important it is to hold something with care. And maybe, just maybe, tonight, as you lie here, still and quiet, you can feel a little of it too. The hush of that village. The low light, the soft creak of a wooden floor, the scent of yeast and warmth, the sound of a distant owl, the weight of time that doesn't press, but settles, like a quilt, like snow, like sleep. So let it be enough. Let the story end here, not with a final word, but with the feeling of everything having arrived exactly where it should. The ale is finished. The mugs are clean. The fires are low. Outside, the night holds the world in silence. And now, so can you.